Inflation, or the increase in the price of many goods and services across the economy over time, has skyrocketed. In some countries, it has reached record levels. Commodity and labor shortages, supply gridlocks, disruption hikes in oil prices, panic buying, shifts in buying patterns for some goods triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course, the war in Ukraine are responsible for the high prices. Individuals and businesses are balking at the high prices. Our dollars are buying less, businesses are spending more to operate, and our savings and investments are dwindling. At the same time, workers' incomes are not keeping up with the spike in prices. All reminiscent of Calypsonian PJ's hit, Rice Gone Up, Sugar Gone Up. The rapid and unpredictable changes in prices is a challenge for central banks and policymakers because it threatens the region's economic prosperity and destabilizes our social development. This is an issue at the top of mind for all Caribbean people. Therefore, on the occasion of its 50th birthday, the Central Bank of Barbados is the proud sponsor of a discussion on how can Caribbean central banks fight inflation. Our guests are Cleviston Haynes, Governor of the Central Bank of Barbados, Richard Byles, Governor of the Bank of Jamaica, and Caribbean economist Marla Dukharan. They'll examine some of the policy tools central banks use to help ease the inflationary pressures and restore price stability. Thanks to our viewers across the region and beyond for tuning in. I am your host, Toni Thorne, welcoming all to this special Caribbean Economic Forum. Good night and a welcome once again. Good night to all viewers tuning in from across the English-speaking Caribbean and internationally to this special edition of the Central Bank of Barbados' Caribbean Economic Forum. I said before, this is a special edition. This is because the bank is celebrating 50 years of existence in this year of 2022. As host, I would like to take this opportunity to wish the Central Bank of Barbados a wonderful 50th anniversary. The Central Bank of Barbados is and continues to be a beacon of excellence, integrity, dependability, and sustainability for the people of Barbados and throughout the Caribbean. Now to tonight's topic, inflation, a theme which permeates news publications and productions currently all across the world. Our topic for tonight is how can Caribbean central banks fight inflation? And we have three amazing panelists, Governor Byles, Governor Haynes, and Miss Dukharan, but she has given me special permission to refer to her as simply Marla. Good night, panelists. How are you?
Good night. We're well.
Very well, thank you.
Thank you so much. I will start with our results from a survey that we did publicly, and I wanted to get your thoughts, particularly Governor Haynes and Governor Byles, on this. To what extent have the increases in prices impacted your spending patterns over the last 2 years? 78% of persons said significant change in spending, 18% said little change in spending, and 4% said no change in spending. What are your thoughts on that? I will go to Ms. Dukharan. What are your thoughts on the fact that 78% of persons have said that within the last 2 years, they've seen a significant change in their spending? I think you're on mute, Ms. Dukharan. I think that's the most popular phrase of the pandemic. I will move on to ask Governor Haynes on that. Can you hear me, Ms.
Okay.
Dukharan? Yes, Governor Haynes.
Yes. So first of all, let me thank everyone for joining us tonight as the bank celebrates its 50th anniversary. And a particular special thank you to Governor Byles and to Marla for joining us. I think the results are not surprising in the sense that the region and globally, there has been a pickup in inflation over the last 2 years. And I think it's important for us to understand why prices are rising. Uh, Coming off of COVID, I think during the COVID period, there was a dampening of prices, particularly for oil, because demand globally fell and therefore oil prices fell. And what has happened as we've sought to recover from the COVID pandemic and as economic activity has picked up, the demand for oil has risen and that recovery in demand has started to push prices up. And that has been complicated by the fact that there have been significant disruptions in the supply chain, which means that it's more difficult to get goods. So there's an imbalance between the demand for and the supply of goods, and that is pushing prices up. And the situation obviously has been worsened by what has happened since the Ukraine-Russia conflict, because both the Ukraine and Russia are significant suppliers of commodities, both food as well as metals and of oil. And the fact that you have this conflict ongoing, there are sanctions being placed on Russia, etc. What one has seen, therefore, is a further spike in prices. And we must recognize that within the region, 40% or so of our imports are attributable to food and energy. So if you have significant price increases in those areas, then that gets fed into our economies because the Caribbean economy is interdependent with the rest of the world. We cannot isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. And if we are importing 40% of our goods for food and energy, then that is going to be reflected in the prices that we face.
Thank you so much, Governor Haynes. You've explained that wonderfully. I'll now move to Governor Byles. What do you think is an appropriate target for inflation across the Caribbean? And are there significant circumstances where inflation can be beneficial?
Thank you for the question. Could I first, though, congratulate the Central Bank of Barbados on their 50th anniversary? I believe this year we too have an anniversary we're celebrating. I believe it's our 60th. So we are twinned in that respect. So what range of inflation each nation targets really depends on the stage of development and what their policies are. In Jamaica, we have a pretty high debt burden. And because of that, we run a major surplus on our primary balance, but also a small one on our fiscal balance. And that tends to be contractionary. Uh, so on the monetary side, we try to be more expansionary. We have brought rates down really low. Uh, Pre-pandemic, our rate was 0.5%, our policy rate, and that tends to be very accommodating and to allow businesses to expand and to grow. So for us, inflation in a range of 4 to 6% is appropriate. It helps us to generate growth, encourage business, and nonetheless be able to deal with our high debt to GDP. So some amount of inflation is of use. It helps us to run a nominal GDP that is large enough to help suppress the ratio of GDP to debt, as well as it helps to stimulate the economy. Some economies prefer 2 to 4, possibly a different stage of development or different policies. But that is what we target here in Jamaica, 4 to 6%.
Thank you so much, Governor Byles. I'll go to Marla. Marla, are you there?
Thanks. Yes, are you hearing me now, Toni?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Yes.
I want
Okay,
to
good.
talk to you
Go ahead.
about advanced economies and what are they currently doing to fight inflation, and what's your pulse on that? Could they be doing more? Are they doing a good job? Please share this with us.
Thanks. So in the first place, the developed world found itself last year dealing with an economic rebound that was so strong that it was considered overheating by many policymakers, and that is the recovery in jobs and spending was causing demand-driven inflation in the advanced economies. In the US, in March this year, the Federal Reserve hiked its benchmark borrowing rate for the first time since late 2018, increasing it by a quarter percentage point. And yesterday, they raised the policy rate again in the US, this time by half a percentage point to get a handle on the worst inflation that America has seen in 40 years. It's the first time in 22 years that the Fed has hiked rates this much. And officials have also signaled that they will release a plan for shrinking their 9 trillion US dollar balance sheet starting in June. And this policy will further push borrowing costs up. So this two-pronged approach to cool off the economy is expected to continue throughout this year, and several policymakers in the US have said that they hope to get interest rates above 2% by the end of this year. So taken together, these moves could prove to be the fastest withdrawal of monetary support in decades in the US. Turning to Europe, according to their central bank president, after one of the steepest contractions in GDP ever recorded in peacetime, we have seen the steepest recovery in GDP on record. Employment has never fallen by so much and then rebounded so quickly. And setting aside the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war, the economy in Europe has been on track to achieve a greater utilization of resources and a tighter labor market than before the pandemic. And the last time the euro area saw unemployment rates at today's levels was in the 1970s. So we're also seeing overheating as well as of last year. They began in December last year with a step-by-step reduction in the pace of asset purchases, and they also adjusted their communication strategy. And their medium-term goal for inflation is 2%. So both in the US and in Europe and other advanced economies, their inflation began last year. It was demand driven. It has now started to become more supply side driven, as Governor Haynes had discussed earlier about oil price hikes. And so, in a nutshell, theirs is coming from both demand and supply, demand first and now supply side, whereas ours is quite different and it's mostly supply side driven. What more can be done? I think the efforts to address Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which don't stop at sanctions, which sanctions really have never worked anyway, is what I think is needed. But I'm just an economist, not an international relations expert.
Thank you so much, Marla. I will go to Governor Byles. This is a quite a mouthful of a question, but it's something that we're very curious about, Governor Byles. In the February 21st press statement of 2022, you, Mr. Richard Byles, reaffirmed the Bank of Jamaica's commitment to fulfilling its mandate of price stability. The annual point-to-point inflation rate in Jamaica reached an 11-year high of 11.3%. The Bank of Jamaica raised interest rates 4 times since September 2021. The last time I hosted the CEF, we lauded the performance of the Jamaican economy, and we continue to do so. What has been your recent experience with inflation targeting, and what are the measures you think are needed to improve the experience? A lot to take in, Governor Byles.
Yes, that's a big question. I should get bonus points for this one.
Yes, you will. You will.
Thank you. Jamaica is unique in the English-speaking Caribbean in that we have adopted inflation targeting as our main mandate in the central bank. We did this back in 2020 when we became an independent central bank. So how do we impact inflation? Well, we use a number of tools. One is that we adjust our policy rate. And what that does is it impacts commercial banks' lending rates, their deposit rates. It therefore has an effect on aggregate demand, so that interest rates rise, cost of debt rises. It slows the economy, and that sounds bad, but that's a trade-off that you get when you're fighting inflation. You have to slow the economy so that prices don't run away from you. It tends to temper expectations also. Uh, Raising Jamaican dollar asset rates also makes Jamaican assets more attractive vis-a-vis US dollar assets, and that impacts our exchange rate and keeps the volatility of the exchange rate quite low. So the policy rate movement is a primary tool and very important to us. Secondly, we conduct open market operations where we impact liquidity. So if we want to tighten, we take liquidity out of the system, make sure that banks don't have enough liquidity to lend freely, makes it backs up the higher interest rate and makes borrowing a little bit more expensive. Thirdly, we intervene in the foreign exchange market to the extent there is any unnecessary volatility. As you know, in times of crisis, there's always a tendency to go for foreign currency to be safe. And we have to try to minimize that volatility because that volatility percolates right through to the prices of the goods that we import. So we play a pretty active role in the foreign exchange market, not to set the rate, but really to limit the volatility. Finally, we use a tool of communication. And this is really important because what it does is it gives forward guidance to the business community and to the financial system, what it is we are going to do, when we will do it, so that they are forewarned and prepared. We also meet with special interest groups to answer their questions and to make our policies very clear to them. I would say that the experience that we have had in the last couple of months, there are a number of shortfalls, and let me quickly just address them. One is that we have a pretty high rate of dollarization in Jamaica. So when you look on our deposits in our commercial banks, 43% of them are made up of US dollars. And adjusting our policy rate, which is a Jamaican dollar rate, therefore has no impact on those deposits. So that's one problem, the high dollarization. Secondly, we have experienced a pretty slow responsiveness of the financial institutions to the rise in interest rates that we have declared. We expect that eventually they will respond, but the asymmetry in our commercial banking community, where we have a couple of banks that dominate, means that there's not as much competition and they're not as responsive to rate hikes that we mandate. And finally, we find that in a period of some crisis, the pass-through of foreign exchange prices to inflation is almost one-to-one. So in periods of relative calm, it is pretty low, about 30%. But in times of some heightened concern, it can get up to as high as 70%. And that means that our participation in the foreign exchange market is really important. I would end by saying the one experience I think that we need to address in the near future is to get the competitiveness for deposits in the DTI sector to be more heightened. The asymmetry is really having an impact on the responsiveness. And the next couple of years, we will be working on how to make deposits or more portable so that you can move from one bank to another very easily.
Sounds very interesting. Open banking?
Eventually, open banking take us a while to get there, but I see that you're familiar
But
with
you
that.
will. Yes,
Great.
yes, I am. My next question: what is the best in class? And this is something I think everybody is really concerned about: salaries and inflation. So my question is: what is the best in class approach to adjusting or addressing citizens' salaries so that they're commensurate with inflation? Allow me to repeat that. What is the best in class approach to adjusting or addressing citizens' salaries so that they're commensurate with inflation? I will start off with Ms. Dukharan, and that I will then go to Governor Haynes to answer that question. Marla.
Thank you, Toni. I just want to highlight, first of all, that the pressure of higher prices is universal, but it affects those at the lower income levels and those with fixed incomes like pensioners. It affects them disproportionately. And in these cases, I think the state must intervene to ensure that the disadvantaged among us are supported appropriately. On the other hand, wage earners who are currently engaged in salary negotiations or unions negotiating on their behalf will likely ask for wage increases commensurate with inflation. However, one thing is important to remember, that in the absence of increases in productivity, wage increases that simply reflect inflation and which are completely delinked from performance will only serve to make whatever you are producing uncompetitive over time and drive you out of the market, which doesn't benefit anyone. We have to ensure that when we are negotiating for higher wages, we are also adding higher value.
I love that answer. Governor Haynes.
Yes, so let me say that I share the insights which Marla have provided in this particular area. Essentially, you know, a wage adjustment to match inflation is really not a first best option for us. Indeed, it creates the risk of a sort of wage price spiral because once the wages have also risen, then that is going to be followed by increased prices. And we certainly here in Barbados have had that experience in the late 70s, early 80s, where we tried to match the price increases with the wages, and all you had really was very high inflation until probably the early 80s, and then it was able to taper off. But you come back to the problem which I think Marla has highlighted, is that once you have prices increasing rapidly, then those who are at the bottom will be perhaps impacted more because they spend more of their time, more of their income on food than those who have higher incomes. And what you have to appreciate here is that the supply shock that we are facing right now is impacting largely food and is impacting energy. Those who've had a chance to read our last press release will see that many of the other categories on which persons spend have not really been moving very quickly. But the high ticket items have been food and energy, and that is what really is driving the inflation rate. And I think in some countries, I'm not sure if Jamaica does it as one that is inflation targeting. In some countries, the focus is not on the headline inflation rate, but really on what they call the core inflation rate. That is, you take out food and energy because those are the things over which you really have very little control, and then you try to focus on the underlying inflation rate. So in terms of how we address the impact of these prices on the average citizen is really to be able to find targeted measures that are perhaps time bound, because the food increases and the energy price increases are really likely to be transitory. In other words, and those who've seen oil prices over time will see that they're very volatile. So sometimes oil prices may fall to $34 a barrel. Recently, they've exceeded $100 a barrel. They're likely to come back down. The expectation, which the IMF certainly has, is that these prices will come down later in 2022 and 2023. So we run the danger of trying to have wage increases that are adapting to inflation, which is a sort of, or to price levels, which are a temporary cycle. And when these things change, you've already embedded those wage increases in, and therefore they're more difficult to reverse. So you need, I think, transfers perhaps that are time bound. So you may be doing it for a particular period of time, so as to be able to allow people to be able to adapt, but it is not a permanent feature of the government's expenditure or tax system.
Thank you
Can
so
I say
much,
that,
Marla.
Tony? Tony, could I
Go
just say,
ahead, Governor Byles.
I think Clever makes some really good points there about it, not being permanently embedded. In Jamaica, for example, in March, where we recorded 11.3% inflation, fully 76% of that 11.3 was food and energy. And if those prices have risen to a peak and have a tendency to fall again, it's going to have a very powerful effect on inflation on the way down. So I think that Governor Haynes makes a really important point that in managing wage expectations, which are genuine and need to be discussed and met, we need to do it in creative ways that allows for when inflation deflates or when we have deflation, we're not stuck with these high costs up at the top.
Thank you so much, Governor Byles. Thank you for answering that question, all three of my panelists, because that's a very pertinent question, and I know a lot of people are very curious about it all across social media. Let's go to the second survey and the results of the second survey that we conducted. How should policymakers better manage the increase in prices? 40% say introduce price controls. 26% say reduce taxes on goods. 18% reduce taxes on income. 12% subsidize the cost of food and gas. And 4% reduce interest rates on borrowing. I am going to ask the only lady on the panel to talk to us about this. How do you think, given these results, how should policymakers better manage the increase in prices?
That's an interesting response. Sorry.
No, please go ahead.
Toni,
go ahead, please, Marla.
Governor Byles, you go ahead.
No. You go ahead, please.
So I thought it was interesting that they said we should have price, basically limits on prices and price controls. I don't know that that's necessarily a policy that works, because whenever you control price and there's a restriction on supply, which is what we're facing now with some of the constraints we have with shipping and so on, what ends up happening is that you end up with a black market. So that was an interesting response, and I'm not quite sure how well it will work. But in managing prices in general, I mean, the first thing I want to highlight is that it's so important for us to have the right data, robust and recent data. And both governors outlined what the March data is for Jamaica and Barbados. And in my country, we don't even have March data for inflation. Can you believe? We only have February inflation, and that was 4.2%, which is actually not that high. If you look at the 13-year historical average for inflation, whereas in Jamaica you have 57%, inflation is 57% higher now. In Barbados, it's more than twice as high as the 13-year average. In Trinidad, it was roughly the same. So that's the first thing. Sometimes we get caught up in the hype and we don't have the data to actually validate whether or not there is a problem. So that I congratulate both Barbados and Jamaica for having the data. And so that's one thing that I think we need to address. The other thing is adjusting our expectations based on changing circumstances. Governor Haynes just highlighted that the expectation is that oil prices should come down. As a matter of fact, the US Energy Information Administration expects the average price of oil to fall to $93 a barrel in 2023. Already, it fell from 108 in March to 102 on average in April. However, the EU just announced that they are likely to impose sanctions on Russia, that in 6 months there will be no exports of crude going to Europe or being transshipped through Europe or by European ships. And then by the end of the year, even refined product, they will put restrictions on. And so that the very recent development, as of yesterday, I think it was, means that perhaps because supply will be that much more restricted, that outlook for prices of oil coming down might need to be revised. So that's the other thing. We need to always be abreast of the data coming to us.
Thank you so much, Ms. Dukharan. And we are approaching our break. Please stay tuned. This is a wonderful discussion. As I said, inflation affects all of us. Up next, we have our social media moderator, Dr. Anki Scott Joseph. Right after the break, don't move. We'll be right back.
CEF is for me and you. Beyond COVID, CEF is for me and you. Caribbean Economic Forum move. Beyond COVID, CEF is for me and you. Caribbean Economic Forum. Log on, tune in, and join the conversations and engage with the experts. Help to find common solutions for common problems during this COVID situation. We fighting to protect our livelihood across the nation. This is for we to learn, share ideas and concerns, to live life like we deserve. We must change we mindset first. Build strong economies, closer societies. We all have a duty. CEF is for me and you. Beyond COVID, CEF is for me and you. Caribbean Economic Forum.
Both sides of the coin tells the history of the first 45 years of the Central Bank of Barbados. It salutes unsung heroes who fashioned a modern society and economy and built an institution of which every Barbadian can be proud. Perfect for economists, business people, politicians, and anyone who wants to learn more about the Central Bank of Barbados and how its staff serves you and contributes to our economic and financial development. Download your free copy today.
Did I ever tell you the story about the toaster?
No, but I'll probably get a kick out of it.
So I went to my bank for a loan for an overseas trip. Gave her my documents. Everything seemed to be in order. Then she says,
Just one sec, let me check your credit history. The credit search shows you don't have a credit history.
I'm 19. I just started working. I'm thinking, credit history? So she says,
No problem. Here's what you can do. Buy something you need on hire purchase terms. The credit information which you agreed to share will be passed on to a credit bureau which keeps a record of your payment history. Once you pay your loan off in full and on time, your credit rating will remain excellent and we could offer you another loan once you keep it that way.
So what did you do?
I went and I bought the cheapest thing I could find, a toaster. Went on my trip, paid off my loans on time, and now I have perfect credit history.
How do you know it's perfect?
I request one free copy of my credit report each year.
Well, at least you get to know your credit's not toast.
So Cardi, but I'll toast to that.
50 years of financial stability, building economic prosperity. The Central Bank of Barbados, living the legacy, continuing the journey, keeping Barbados strong. Together we can make it through any storm. We're living the legacy, continuing the journey.
The Central Bank of Barbados, celebrating 50 years of financial stability and economic prosperity.
Welcome back. This is our 50th anniversary edition of the Central Bank of Barbados' Caribbean Economic Forum. The topic for tonight, how can Caribbean central banks fight inflation? Welcome back to my panelists. We are going to go to our social media moderator, Dr. Anki Scott Joseph. Good night, Anki. How are you?
Good evening, Toni. I'm fine, thank you, and good evening to everyone. In summary, the main message from this side is that coordinated effort is needed between both government and central bank to lower the pressure of inflation. Much emphasis needs to be placed on retail price management and supply chain management. However, participants here are of the view that even when we address supply chain issues, when these are normalized, the real issues still arises. Low wage and high levels of unemployment. And there's also the supply side effect policy, that is our propensity to consume. So controlling prices seem to be the main focus on this end. Governor Haynes, one of the difficult acts is adjusting interest rates in an economy that's already weak and fragile and uncertain. And I'm sure you will agree with me that strategies, both monetary and fiscal, are required. But how practical do you think it is for government to revisit its approach to competitiveness, to stimulate competition, to encourage and promote lower prices, specifically encouraging bulk buying membership businesses who seem to have been providing lower prices? Thank you and have a good night.
Anki, I
Thanks for
see
that.
that.
Yes, I was saying thank you for that question, Anki. Clearly, the issue of competition is very important. We live in very small economies where often there are just a few suppliers, and therefore, all of our economic models tell us that deviates from the perfect competition where you have lots of suppliers, lots of buyers, and therefore you're able to get relatively low prices. So we face that as a structural feature of our economies, whether it's in Barbados, Jamaica, or wherever. Obviously, the smaller the economy, perhaps the greater the problem. So from our perspective, this is where sometimes government has to chip in. But I think what people have to recognize is that government has very limited fiscal space in what it can actually do. Price controls, in my judgment, don't really work. Because once, and I think this is the point that Marla was making, so once you have price controls, you run the risk of shortages. And therefore, what you think is that you're controlling a price, but you may actually not have the commodity at all. And therefore, that really is not the approach we want to go. Going back to your chart before where you showed that people were talking about taxes and both on goods or income. And we have to recognize that our governments generally, especially coming out of COVID, have limited fiscal space and in some cases very limited borrowing capacity. Because once we talk about reducing the taxes, we also have to look therefore at the deficits that may ensue, and those deficits have to be financed. So we have to take an overall macroeconomic perspective, and I think that's the first point that Anki made of a coordination between governments and the central banks become very important, because it's easy for us to think that the solution is for us to reduce taxes or to whether on incomes or on goods, but we have to look to see what the impact is going to be on the fiscal. So this is a particular challenge that we have to face, because we have to remember that this is a supply shock. This is not something that is necessarily being driven by the domestic economy, but is really something that is happening from outside, and we are effectively importing the inflation of other countries. And in our case, as a fixed exchange rate country, we really import US inflation. And what you see is that the inflation rate in the US has gone up, and likewise in our situation, the inflation is going to go up while there is rising. So that goes back to my original point that we really have to look to see if there are targeted measures that we can utilize to be able to assist those, particularly those at the bottom end of the scale, because they spend a large proportion of their income on food, and therefore they're going to be particularly impacted by the spike in prices that we've had over the last few months.
Thank you so much, Governor Haynes. I'm going to break the rules of my script and just go back to Governor Byles. I do know in the question that I asked about best-in-class approach to adjusting or addressing citizens' salaries, you were going to make a point. Am I correct or am I incorrect, sir?
Well, I thought that Clevy made the point very eloquently, as did Marla. So that's fine with me. I would say, though, that when it comes to Jamaica's experience with trying to alleviate the pressure of inflation on the poor, the approach that the government has adopted here is not to reduce the taxes, but to focus subsidy temporarily on particular groups of people, particularly those at the base of the society, students, taxi operators who are particularly impacted by energy prices, and households that consume a very small amount of electricity. So there are temporary programs in place that help to fund those rising prices. And because taxes are often impacted positively by inflation, some of that subsidy gets paid by the extra taxes that come from inflation. So that's a method that we have adopted here in Jamaica.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go to you, Marla. We have been hearing about all these different products that come directly from Russia. I'm going to embarrass myself and say it's only today that I realized that 40% of a metal or a substance called palladium was produced by Russia, and that has caused a lot of issues along the supply chain. Officials of the Inter-American Development Bank have said that the shortage of items on the global stage could actually present opportunities for Caribbean nations, particularly providing goods and services for those countries who have been affected in terms of getting issues, receiving certain products and services from Russia and from Ukraine. We also have Caribbean governments committing to produce 25% of their food supply by 2025. Can we identify what some of these opportunities are, as explained by the Inter-American Development Bank?
Thanks, Tony. Let me quote the CARICOM Secretary General, Dr. Carla Barnett's recent Salisis lecture as it relates to CARICOM's plan of action that you just mentioned. And this is what Dr. Barnett said. Even before COVID, CARICOM had agreed in 2018 to target a reduction of 25% by 2025 in the US $5 billion food import bill as a way of stimulating economic growth and regional trade. This CARICOM priority is being led by the President of Guyana, who, among the CARICOM heads of government, has responsibility for agriculture. According to Dr. Barnett, intra-regional trade in manufactured goods and agri-foods has lagged well behind the levels of trade between CSME members and third countries, and the pattern of trade within the region is significantly skewed towards the more developed countries. Inadequate intra-regional shipping, high freight and other logistics costs, complicated payment arrangements, and unnecessary bureaucratic measures all serve to frustrate exports, especially from the least developed countries to the more developed countries in CARICOM. Why is it that the shipment of goods between Southern Caribbean islands and the US is easier to arrange than shipment between the Northern Leeward and Southern Windward Islands? Or so it seems. Studies have shown that resolving the transportation challenge in the region could boost intra-regional trade by at least 200%. And there is no doubt that affordable travel would allow for greater commingling of our people, thereby strengthening and feeding the belonging of to a community. End quote. So basically, the challenges abound in realizing this goal of 25% reduction by 2025 in imported goods. And now that we have Dr. Carla Barnett at the head of CARICOM, we probably have the best chance ever of pulling off a greater level of regional cooperation, in my view. Already under her watch, we have a new protocol to amend the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, which provides for groups of at least 3 member states to establish enhanced cooperation among themselves. In other words, a coalition of the willing can now move ahead even if the rest are unable or unwilling. I look forward to hearing about more progress under CARICOM's new leader, Dr. Carla Barnett, and she is the first female CARICOM Secretary General, by the way. So I am optimistic that this is something we can achieve if we all put our minds to it and if the coalition of the willing will move forward.
Thank you so much, Marla. I'm going to continue on the whole theme of Russia and production and how much of an impact these sanctions have made on them. Russia is the world's largest natural gas exporter and the second largest exporter of crude oil. The former managing director of the World Bank, Juan Jose de Boub, suggested that Caribbean governments increase their national budgets by Governor Haynes.
From my perspective, not very practical. I think Richard made the point a few minutes ago that with inflation, you do get increased revenues. But I think the general point which I want to make, which I made earlier, is that there's limited fiscal space for Caribbean governments, and to the extent that increased expenditure leads to increased deficits, there is limited borrowing capacity. As you know, many of the Caribbean governments are highly indebted, and therefore access to new financing is not always as easy as they would want. So a lot will depend on the inflation dividend on revenue, because to the extent that you get a large improvement in your revenues because of the inflation, it does provide you with a little bit more opportunity to be able to spend more. But it also might depend if the dividend is not large enough and you want to engage in something as large as 20 or 25%, then you will have to look at how are you going to finance it. And I think sometimes when we think of the fiscal, we think of the size of the deficit without thinking about the financing requirement, because the financing is really what makes the deficit hang together. If you don't have enough financing, then you run the risk of building arrears into your system. And that obviously leads to instability. So from a broader Caribbean perspective, I would think that there's not a lot of capacity for increasing expenditure by that magnitude. Doesn't mean that we couldn't increase it. I think what we do have to do, however, is to be selective in where we spend our money. And we have to decide the extent to which you want to engage, for example, in capital enhancing, in growth enhancing capital expenditures versus other types, and the amount that you want to be able to put towards helping to defray the impact on the less well off in a society.
Thank you so much, Governor Haynes. At this point in time, I'm going to introduce our first intervener, sorry. Ayana Young Marshall, lecturer, international business, University of the West Indies. And I am very pleased to see her tonight because she was one of my favorite lecturers at UWI. Good night, ma'am. How are you?
Good night to you. I'm not allowed to have favorites, but the feeling is also mutual. Good night also to the panel. Congratulations to the Central Bank of Barbados on your jubilee. And that represents, I don't know if people appreciate what that means, in terms of your role in, economic stability and development in Barbados. It's been 50 solid years. So congratulations. Now my question takes me back to the whole issue of the single market. And we teach the single market, we teach the CARICOM single market and economy at, in all our classes. But my question surrounds the single economy. So I teach my students about the promises and prospects of the CSME, particularly as it relates to trade, competitiveness, entrepreneurship, and employment opportunities for them as categories that can move freely. University graduates can move freely. And of course, economic development imperatives in general. So my question to the governors is, where are we with the single economy? Has it been abandoned? Is it a fleeting illusion? Should we stop teaching our students about the single economy? How do you think that the CSME could help central banks fight inflation? Thank you.
Governor Byles?
Well, I was hoping you'd start with Governor Haynes, and he would, strike all of the sixes, and I'd just come in with the singles. So I'm all in favor of having a larger market and pooling together our resources. But I'm old enough to know that there are problems. We have been trying to pursue this dream for certainly all of my adult life, and we have not been able to overcome some of the rigidities. At the same time, there are a number of small nations that have shown us that you can become highly successful even if you are small. And I think the lessons that I've drawn from them is education, innovation, and management. Those three things, I think, are the resources that any nation, whether large or small, needs to be successful in today's world. It doesn't hurt if you have size and if you have a wide range of resources, but when it comes down to carving out a competitive space for for yourself in this technological 2022 to whenever, it really requires a very high level of education in the population, a sense of innovation, because you want to be not only educated, you want to be on more or less on the cutting edge of technology, so that the value added from what you produce or what you participated is of high quality. And you do need, of course, to have good management. And by management, I mean of the country. Do the right thing at the right time, stick it out. Those ingredients are what Singapore took and built their first world nation as we see it today. And there are many other small economies, Estonia and others, that can boast a similar success.
Thank
Yes.
you.
So I think I broadly agree with Richard. We have been pursuing the dream of coming together for quite a long time, going back to the Federation in '58 and even before. And we have to recognize that what we have is a very small market. We suffer from diseconomies of scale. And it's important for us, therefore, to be able to come together, to work together in order to be able to grow the region. I think, and Marla outlined it a few minutes ago in terms of the coalition of the willing. We're beginning to see signs of increased cooperation within the region on economic matters. And those who will be following the discussions with Barbados and Guyana and I think Suriname and so on are seeing the potential for us to be able to work together. And I believe that once we begin to see success, others will join in the experiment to be able to bring this entire region together, because economies of scale is what are going to take for us to be able to move forward. So I don't think that we have abandoned the CSME. I think perhaps our path got a little bit diverted for a few years, but I'm beginning to see some progress, and hopefully we'll be able to build on that progress in the years ahead, so that we have a strong regional economy. And this is going to be very important. Crises tend to create action. Sometimes we need to do things and we don't do them because we're comfortable in what we're doing. But once you face particular crises, then you find that those who are responsible become more active and they move with greater expedition to get things done. And I believe that that is what is going to happen in the years as we go forward.
Thank you so much, Governor Byles and Governor Haynes. Let's go to WhatsApp. We have a WhatsApp question. To what extent would fuel and electricity price increases have pushed up March inflation numbers in Jamaica and Barbados? To what extent would fuel and electricity price increases have pushed up March inflation numbers in Jamaica and Barbados? I will start with Governor Byles.
Thank you, Toni. I just repeat what I said a little earlier. Our March numbers are quite astonishing. We had inflation of 11.3%, and fully 76% of that was driven by energy prices and food prices. So that's where our inflation is coming from solidly.
And I think the same experience in Barbados. If you look, you will see that we've had double-digit increases for both food and energy over the past year, and the recent spike, obviously, in these prices has impacted us. But that is the situation that we face. All because we are highly import dependent economies. Once these prices rise, then we are going to face those increases. The Barbados government, in its recent budgetary statement, has sought to cap the value-added tax on gasoline and diesel, and so that helps to temper the increase. But we have to pay for the oil, and therefore it doesn't stop these prices from going up if international prices continue to rise. And what you will probably see is that when international prices rise, we do get the increase with a little bit of lag. And when international prices start to fall, you'll also see the declines with a little bit of a lag. So I think around February, March is when the prices started to surge, and that's why I think you would have seen significant increases in March.
We're going to have one more WhatsApp question. I think we have time for that. Are central banks contemplating any adjustment of interest rates in line with the upward movement of international rates? What are the likely implications of increased rates for the domestic economy? I'm going to go to Governor Haynes.
Okay. All right. So in the context of Barbados, as you're aware, there's lots of excess liquidity in the domestic banking system, and with that amount of liquidity in the system, the natural tendency will be for rates to remain low. As you're aware, in Barbados, domestic deposit rates are less than 1%. In fact, they're rather closer to zero, and that has had the beneficial impact of lower rates, low lending rates. For example, mortgages are under 4%. These are historic lows, and that's because we have so much liquidity in the system. So at present, there is no plan to raise rates in line with the international rates, but I would say to you that we also have to continue to monitor the extent to which international rates rise, because if there's a wide gap between domestic rates and international rates, it potentially could have an impact on capital flows. And that is something that we as a central bank have to continue to monitor, capital flows. But I would say to you that at present, our thinking is that we will not need to move rates up, and that is speaking as May 5th, 2022. We won't need to move rates up in line with the international, because unlike Jamaica, we're not an inflation targeter. We try to get our inflation stability through our adherence to a fixed exchange rate. But as I pointed out earlier, notwithstanding a fixed exchange rate, you're going to be importing the inflation of the country to which your currency is tied.
Thank you so much, Governor Haynes. This has been a wonderful discussion, and it continues to be a wonderful discussion. The title for anyone who is now joining us: How can Caribbean central banks fight inflation? Don't move. Don't switch the channel. We'll be right back.
Although we're called a bank, the Central Bank of Barbados is not like other banks. We are a statutory body, and we work alongside government to safeguard the Barbados dollar's exchange rate with the US dollar. We also work with the Financial Services Commission to monitor the entire financial system. So even though you cannot get a loan or open an account with us, we are very important and are truly committed to Barbados's continued economic growth and financial stability.
Each summer, the Central Bank of Barbados offers a student a chance to help change the world through a scholarship to attend the Caribbean Science Foundation's student program for innovation in science and engineering. It's designed for 16 and 17-year-olds gifted in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and is a replica of the well-known MITES program at MIT. We're nurturing young, inquisitive minds who could transform our economy, our region, and our world.
Join the Governor of the Central Bank of Barbados in January, May, August, and October as he explains the country's economic performance, reveals economic policy direction, answers your questions live online, and brings clarity to how the economy works and what to expect. The Central Bank of Barbados presents the Barbados Quarterly Economic Review. If you missed the live stream, download the recording or the full text on demand at centralbank.org.bb.
Welcome back to this special edition of the Central Bank of Barbados' Caribbean Economic Forum as the Central Bank celebrates its 50th anniversary this year in 2022. Welcome back to my panelists as well. I am going to go to our second intervener joining us from the beautiful island of Montserrat. His name is Cameron KB. He's a Trade and Quality Infrastructure Officer, Trade, Investment, and Bureau for Standards and Quality, Office of the Premier, Montserrat. Welcome to this edition of the Caribbean Economic Forum, Cameron. Happy to have you.
Thank you very much for that welcome. Distinguished good evening to the distinguished panel and also the esteemed guests. Very thankful for the opportunity to be here. Governor Haynes, if I may, for the average person, inflation is primarily recognized in instances of high retail prices on commodities. As a region, we are consumers of a variety of products and services from the Americas and Europe. It is my opinion that the central banks of the Caribbean can provide guidance to the government to engage in mutual investments initiatives to achieve favorable purchase rates and even ease the individual burdens on our foreign reserves. Two initiatives I would suggest are the bulk purchases of fuel and the alternative sourcing of building materials, especially to support home ownership. My question: is there a reasonable approach, especially through fiscal policies, to addressing inflation? And if you could share your opinion on my proposition, if the suggestions are noteworthy. I thank you.
Thank you. If I understand your two questions, one is there a regional approach to addressing the issue of inflation, and I would say generally no. Um, the to the other aspect, I think to the extent that we can engage in bulk purchasing, then that is something that we ought to pursue. You know, and this is not only an issue as it relates to retail prices, but this is more of perhaps an opportunity with some of the large investments which we undertake as a country. I know my own prime minister is very fond of noting that all of our countries within the region suffer from a problem of decaying pipes, which is impacting the delivery of water systems. And therefore, it would behove us to be able to come together to be able to engage in bulk purchasing of new pipes, etc., to be able to address a problem that is going to impact all of us in the region. And so I think if you take that principle forward to the extent that we can use it, and in some cases we have retail companies that operate across borders. So therefore, if you have a company that is in Trinidad, that is in Barbados, that is in Guyana, that is in Jamaica, then that entity probably can engage in bulk purchasing and get the benefit of those lower prices. But we also have to recognize that these are being done by the private sector. And they're not really being done by the government. So you get the benefits from a private sector entity that is able to operate across boundaries. But you will also still have within each of your boundaries entities which are smaller and are operated, and because they're buying smaller volumes, then they're not going to be able to benefit from the lower prices which you were suggesting. So I think we can try to utilize our conglomerates to be able to get that at the retail level, but I think we also have to look to see what we can do at the governmental level, particularly with some of our larger investment projects.
Thank you, Governor Haynes, and thank you, Cameron. Let's go to our emails. Oh, another question for Governor Haynes. I'm going to switch this up because I am going to ask Governor Byles to answer this since we just had Governor Haynes. Governor Byles, how has the foreign exchange fee contributed to price inflation, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, in Jamaica, we don't have a foreign exchange fee. We have a foreign exchange rate. It's a freely traded commodity at all of our commercial banks. You go there, you place your order, and they bid amongst themselves for the foreign currency that is available. So every day there is like a auction amongst people who earn foreign exchange and want to sell it, and those who want to buy it. And the banks sit in the middle, and they are the brokers that make the transactions happen. So there's no explicit fee. You just pay the price for the dollar on that particular day.
Thank you. Governor Haynes, I feel as if I'm firing questions at you. I'd like you to answer that one, though.
Yes. So as you know, there's a 2% foreign exchange fee, and therefore, to the extent that the underlying price increases, then the 2% will be on a higher number, and therefore that will contribute to a higher price for the commodity, the good or commodity that you're trying to import. I think what one has to recognize, and these are some of the trade-offs, is that the foreign exchange fee really was introduced in the context of weak fiscal position. And what it does is it contributes towards the stabilization of the public finances. We anticipate that over time that will go as a fee, but we still have to look to see if we remove that, what is going to generate the revenue that that particular tax currently provides to government. So it's not just simply a question that you remove the fee, because you still have the same goods and services that you're providing. So unless we're able to reduce the costs of government, then we're going to need to be able to generate revenue, whether it comes from a foreign exchange fee, it comes from personal income taxes, it comes from value-added taxes. There needs to be some mechanism to generate the revenues that will enable the public finances to be stabilized, and therefore to be able to provide the goods and services which the citizens so want to get from government.
Thank you so much, Governor Haynes. Let's go to WhatsApp, and I must say that our social media moderator, Anki's doing a great job with moderating these questions. WhatsApp, the focus right now is rightly on protecting the immediate poor, but many in the quote-unquote middle class have had to endure higher taxes and higher prices and are one paycheck away from falling below the poverty line. What can be done to protect them? I am going to ask Ms. Dukharan to address this.
I think it's really unfortunate that most governments in this region and indeed globally do not engage in counter-cyclical fiscal policy, which is when things are stable and strong, you save, and then when things are choppy, you have something to rely on to spend. Off the top of my head, I know the Cayman Islands has counter-cyclical fiscal policy in this region. I know Jamaica also has fiscal rules that ensures that they have more of a counter-cyclical than pro-cyclical fiscal policy approach. But in general, because we've traditionally had deficit spending, most governments in this region, we don't have the fiscal space that allows us to protect the people that, in that question, we're referring to those who are actually already poor or one paycheck away from falling below the poverty line. And of course, the pandemic has driven higher levels of poverty across the globe. And it's a challenge that most governments are not yet able to fully grapple with. One of the ways in which, if you don't have fiscal space, one of the ways in which you can address this current rise in price is by, I know the previous question alluded to the 2% tax on foreign exchange here in Barbados. If you remove that tax, in theory, it could bring prices down, prices of imported goods. The question, though, is, are these adjustments, policy adjustments, reflected in the prices on the shelf? Because there have been instances where we've had price deflation globally on commodities. Early 2020, in the early stages of the pandemic, we had that phenomenon. Yet still, I don't recall seeing any adjustment in prices of goods on the shelf. So whilst we might say, okay, maybe we can flood our market with US dollars and appreciate our currency in the case of Jamaica, or in the case of Barbados, we can remove the 2% FX transaction fee, and that should bring prices down. In theory, all of those things could bring the cost of the imported good down, but does it reflect on the shelf? And that's really where I think we need to focus on. Maybe not so much the government addressing the poverty, rising poverty, and the pressures on people's pockets, based on taxes or other direct subsidies and interventions like that, perhaps it's a question of how do we ensure that when we do make any fiscal policy adjustment on taxes or even exchange rate adjustments, that it's reflected in the price on the shelf. Making sure that that happens, I think, is much more important, and I'm not so sure we do a good enough job of that.
Thank you so much. Let's go to WhatsApp. We have a question from, sorry, Facebook. We have a question from Facebook. What is the average inflation rate in the Caribbean? Governor Byles, I know you said what was a good range, but what's the average rate?
Well, I think that if you take Trinidad, which would be at the lower end because they are energy rich, let's say a little over 5, right up to, I think Jamaica would have one of the highest, 11.3. That's the kind of range that we are experiencing. I believe Barbados is, Clevy, about 9, somewhere around there, and I'm not sure. So between 5 and 11. And I must say, the next couple of months, we're likely to see the impact of inflation even more intense. So April, May, June, we're likely to see prices continue to rise. I don't know how much, but it's more possible that that will happen than for the prices to retreat.
Thank you. Ms. Dukharan, I have another question for you. What do central bankers and economists do if inflation continues to rise over the medium to long term? What is the likely impact on the Caribbean economies should inflation not subside? And how can the average householder assist in reducing the burden?
Well, that's a lot of questions in one.
Yeah.
What can central banks and economists do? I think, okay, so in the first place, we have demand-driven inflation and we have supply-side-driven inflation. As we discussed at length in this forum, what we are largely experiencing now in this region is supply-side inflation, meaning inflation that's coming from our trading partners, and we're importing goods at higher prices, and therefore the prices that we end up having on the shelf are higher over time. So reducing our import dependence is very important. I spoke a little bit about that around the CARICOM plan of reducing our food import bill by 25% by 2025. Another thing we could do is reduce our fuel import bill. And I think there are a million reasons why reducing our import bill in general is beneficial, but I think fuel is probably one of the most important things, because the price of fuel, the price of electricity, the price of gasoline affects almost every other price in the economy, because goods have to use electricity to be produced, to be transported, to be stored, to be delivered to the final consumer. So we really need to look at reducing our imports of fuel and therefore becoming more energy independent. And I actually want to ask both governors here, what are you as a central bank doing to reduce your energy footprint? And actually, I want to share and highlight that what I believe to be the first central bank to achieve net zero actually is right here in the Caribbean. Did you know that the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank right now already, they, because of their solar installations, they actually have 70% of their energy needs met by their solar installation. And once they get their battery installation by the end of the year, the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, based in St. Kitts, will be net zero by the end of this year. And I believe the first central bank in the world who will accomplish this. This is an extremely progressive move. I want to congratulate Governor Antoine and his team he's always been a very progressive change maker in this region, and I want to congratulate him for that move. I think that's living the change that we need to see to address this inflation.
Thank you so much. Didn't know that about St. Kitts. Very, very interesting. Let's go to Facebook because we're very, very pressed for time. Let's go to Facebook. There's a question from Facebook, and I want to make sure that I don't only get my questions answered as moderator, but people get their questions answered. So, what are the open market operations carried out by the Bank of Jamaica?
So open market operations really is a mechanism we use to adjust liquidity in the system. So we have a system where we will buy or sell securities depending on whether we want to increase liquidity or reduce liquidity. And these could be securities, these could be transactions that are done for 2 weeks or 30 days. And we do that on a regular basis. So that would be our main mechanism for adjusting liquidity. Sometimes we also do repos, either from the banks or to the banks. But both of them, in either case, adjust liquidity one way or another. And that's what we call our open market operations.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much,
Okay, here it is.
sir. Getting some feedback. We have another question. Wow, from email coming in. Ms. Dukharan, can and should there be a more concerted regional approach to inflation? What should such an approach look like?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there should be a more regional concerted approach to addressing inflation. And as Dr. Carla Barnett mentioned, there has been progress underway to make this happen. Of course, this is not going to happen overnight, but perhaps the fact that we have this amended protocol that allows for the coalition of the willing, any 3 member states can move ahead once they agree on any initiative that drives greater regional coordination. So I think we are likely some improvements in the level of intra-regional trade and other mechanisms for coordination. Also, we have, as of I think October last year, we have a private sector arm of CARICOM that has been established. So I look forward to more intra-regional coordinated efforts, not just to address inflation specifically, but to address many of the challenges we have. I am aware, however, that one of the challenges we have as a region as it relates to greater intra-regional trade, as mentioned earlier, the issue of transport, but the issue of the payments space. It's very cumbersome if in Barbados we have to pay a supplier in Trinidad or a supplier in Jamaica for goods that we want to import here. We have to find US dollars, buy US dollars from the bank, wire those US dollars to our intermediary, through our intermediary bank, mostly in the United States, to their intermediary bank. And then that intermediary bank sends it back to their bank in their destination country. So you're talking about a minimum of 4 banks in that one transaction. And each of them takes time. Each of them has their due diligence process. Each of them will attract a fee, will impose a fee for the work that they've done. And so by the time this transaction takes place and you pay your supplier from here in Barbados, you pay your supplier in Jamaica or in Trinidad, sometimes weeks have passed and sometimes 100 or 200 US dollars have been spent on wire transfer fees and also other fees associated with the transaction. That's a serious challenge that we need to address. Back in the 1980s, I think it was, we had the multilateral clearing facility in this region that fell apart because it allowed for a credit-based mechanism. But we have to work as a region towards addressing that fundamental issue of payments. And I would like to challenge our two governors here present today, as well as the other governors in the region, to address this challenge with a matter of urgency, especially given the issues we have now with inflation and with the supply constraints that we're facing as a region.
Thank you so much, Ms. Dukharan. I wanted to very quickly get some answers to your question about sustainability efforts and, net zero efforts by both central banks. I know that things such as working from home, not printing as much, are certain little efforts that organizations across the globe are doing to be able to help with net zero. So if you can quickly answer both governors, are there any efforts, just to answer Ms. Dukharan's question, are there any efforts that your banks are doing as it relates to net zero?
Well, I can quickly say no. In Jamaica, we have not really started that initiative, though it's something that I am very interested in personally. And indeed, 2 years ago, when I was with Timothy in St. Kitts, I did see what he was doing there. And I think that to the extent it's economically positive project, we would like to look at a similar thing here in Jamaica.
Governor Haynes?
Yes, right. So I think we have a very limited program where we have also started the whole process of incorporating renewable energy into our mix of energy usage, but it's at a very limited level. We would hope to be able to increase over time. I just wanted, however, to touch on the point which Marla raised, which is the whole question of payments, and to indicate to her that there is at present a system for bilateral payments, which is perhaps underutilized. And this is being looked at now by the governors to see how we can put some more life into it, because we recognize that we need to be able to make sure that payments can take place more easily across the region and to reduce the usage of our hard currencies. And therefore, that is something that the governors are focused on at this point in time.
Thank you so much, Governor. I am going to go to both the governors in this question. The IMF, in its recent spring meetings, was concerned about inflationary pressures on developing countries and its impact on our growth and development and the poor. Further, they suggest urgent action by everyone. What are the policy tools at our disposal to fight inflation, and how do we use them to safeguard our economies and shield the most vulnerable? Kind of similar to the question that I asked Ms. Dukharan, but more a policy tools question. I do know we're very pressed for time, so if you could succinct this into about 45 seconds per person, that would be wonderful. Please forgive me.
Well, I'd quickly just enumerate again the policy tools that we use. We use our policy rate, we adjust that, and that percolates through to bank lending and deposit rates. We participate in open market operations to tighten or loosen liquidity. We conduct interventions into the foreign exchange market, and of course, we communicate as intensely as we possibly can to say what our intentions are and the targets we're trying to achieve. Those are our main policy tools.
Thank you, Governor.
Our main focus really has been to maintain a fixed exchange rate, because that allows us to benefit from low inflation abroad. Obviously, we are facing a supply shock here, and that makes it a little bit more difficult for us to be able to manage the imported inflation. And therefore, that really has to be supported by other measures, non-monetary policy measures, really, to be able to address the question of the high prices that we are currently facing.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask the final question for you, which I will ask everybody to answer. Where do you see? Actually, you know what? Let's go to a commercial break. We'll be right back.
CEF is for me and you. Beyond COVID, CEF is for me and you. Caribbean Economic Forum, move. Beyond COVID, CEF is for me and you. Caribbean Economic Forum. Log on, tune in, and join the conversations and engage with the experts. Help to find common solutions for common problems during this COVID situation. We fighting to protect our livelihood across the nation. This is for we to learn, share ideas and concerns, to live life like we deserve. We must change we mindset first. Build strong economies, closer societies. We all have a duty. CEF is for me and you. Beyond COVID, CEF is for me and you. Caribbean Economic Forum.
And we are back. This is a special edition of the 50th anniversary for the Caribbean Economic Forum, brought to you by the Central Bank of Barbados. Once again, the Central Bank is celebrating 50 years, and I am joined by my distinguished panelists. We've had a wonderful discussion thus far. We have Miss Marla Dukharan, Governor Richard Byles, and Governor Cleviston Haynes, all across from the Caribbean, joining us. Thank you so much again for joining.
A pleasure to be here.
Yes, I wanted to ask you my final question for you. This is my final question as a moderator, not necessarily the session's final question. And I wanted to say, given the current situation with inflation and other economic pressures, what is your forecast for inflation over the next 6 months to a year?
Well, I would say next 6 months pretty stiff. Before the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we thought that in September we'd see a return of inflation to our 4% to 6% corridor. Since the Russia-Ukraine war, we know that's off. And it's going to take us maybe another 12 months before we see that return of inflation to 4 to 6%. So we think that starting the latter part of this year, we'll see prices start to come down, but they are not likely to get to the pre-pandemic level or near to that before about September of next year.
Miss
And I think that,
Miss Dukharan.
yeah,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Governor Haynes. I'll end off with Miss Dukharan. I know we're pressed for time.
yes, I was going to say that, our outlook is similar to Richard's. The good news is that the IMF expects that oil prices will fall by about 13% next year, and food prices will fall by about 5 or 6%. So we do expect some tapering of the inflation, but the next few months, a lot will really depend on what happens in that Russia-Ukraine conflict. It's very difficult for us to be able to make very point forecasts at this point in time because there's a lot of uncertainty, and therefore, to the extent that that situation can be resolved, the sooner we think we'll be able to see some ease in terms of the prices that we are currently facing.
Ms. Dukharan, last but certainly not least.
Yes, I think, like both governors mentioned, we expect inflation will increase. Of course, it will vary across countries in the Caribbean. We're not the same. And as I mentioned, Trinidad, for example, seems to be having less inflationary pressure than Jamaica and Barbados. But I just, in closing, want to highlight something and quote something Christine Lagarde said. She is the president of the European Central Bank. She said, monetary policy today is facing a new challenge. We are increasingly confident that inflation dynamics over the medium term will not return to the pattern we saw before the pandemic. Our outlook today can be neatly summed up in the words of Maya Angelou. We are hoping for the best, prepared for the worst, and unsurprised by anything in between.
Love it. What a wonderful way to end this conversation. I had a really good time chatting and having this very important, pertinent topic, the conversation with Governor Byles, Governor Haynes, and Miss Marla Dukharan. This has been the latest edition of the Central Bank of Barbados' Caribbean Economic Forum. I personally want to wish the Central Bank a happy 50th anniversary. You've been good to me, you've been good to the people of Barbados, and you've been good to the people of the Caribbean. God bless you. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching, and good night.